So hello, everyone. Welcome to our last missed talk of fall 2020. And today we have Susan Wyche. Susan is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information at Michigan State. And she also has a courtesy appointment at MSU's African Studies Center. Her research focuses on the areas of HCI and ICTD. Wyche is also a 2015 recipient of an NSF Career Award. Congratulations for that. And her work has been supported by Google, Facebook, the United States Agency for International Development, NIH, and NSF. So please welcome Susan.
Thank you, Julie. So thank you for having me. I'm Susan Wyche, an associate professor in the Department of Media and Information at Michigan State, and I'm also affiliated with the African Studies Center at MSU. My research broadly examines information and communication technologies, or ICTs. And to date, this has mostly been mobile phones and mostly how they're used in rural parts of Kenya. Today, I'm going to present a case study that's part of a larger 5-year project that's investigating technology use in rural Kenyan households. And specifically, I'm going to be focusing on how I've used cultural probes in my research. So this research is really motivated by a desire to think about design differently in HCI4D and ICTD, and even HCI more broadly. It's influenced by post-colonial computing discourse, as well as findings from nearly a decade of my own research looking at technology use in rural Kenya. In particular, I'm interested in alternatives to this human-centered design approach, or approaches to design that result in these sort of traditional outcomes of design guidelines or a testable prototype. And to do this, I'm exploring different methods that have not widely been used in HCI4D and ICTD fields. And here, I'll primarily talk about cultural probes. I'll also touch on another method that's called design workbooks. So cultural probes. I just want to add this is work that I recently presented at CSCW, and there's a citation for that below. So Bill Gaver introduced cultural probes to the HCI community more than 20 years ago. And what are they? Well, they're designed objects, frequently packages. You see an example of one here. They contain these open-ended and evocative activities that are given to people to pursue over a period of time. These activities are meant to provide designers with an understanding of the local cultures and to inspire design. And my sense is that most people in the HCI community understand this about probes. They're these fun activities. It's another qualitative method you can use for understanding people. And since their introduction, their use has really flourished in HCI. However, there are aspects of probes that are less understood within the HCI community and have not been really well accounted for in their use. The first is that their motivations come from the fields of art and design. So they design a different set of sensibilities than other methods more commonly used in HCI, like interviews or surveys. And these differences are especially related to how cultural probes engage the recipients, embrace the researcher's subjective knowledge, and how the information that emerges from them is analyzed and used to inspire design. There's another aspect of probes use that really is not always well accounted for in studies that use them. Probes are meant to subvert or undermine traditional design methods. And I'm going to say this again. Cultural probes were developed to subvert or undermine traditional design methods. So they were designed to be an alternative to the prevailing rational and scientific processes used in the field. However, this experimental and subversive nature of the original probes has really been lost. And the approach has widely rationalized and used in ways that are similar to traditional design methods. And if you read Boehner and all's work about HCIs, this is really the sort of core message in this paper, is how probes have not really been used as they were originally intended to within HCI. So in this case study, I talk about my efforts to use cultural probes, how they were originally intended to be used. And my goal is to convince you that doing this can really benefit design work in HCI4D and ICTD and HCI more broadly. And the project is inspired by this book that you see here, The Presence Project, written by Bill Gaber and his colleagues. The book describes why cultural probes were developed and how they were used to investigate how technology could be used to increase the presence of older adults in these 3 European towns. The book also features design proposals that were inspired by the participants' probe returns. And so what I'm going to argue is that cultural probes and using them as they are originally intended to be used can benefit the fields of HCI4D, ICTD, and HCI more broadly in these 3 ways. By raising questions about generalizability in research, by raising questions about objectivity in research, and by raising questions about the pursuit of a single design solution. So I'm going to talk about my cultural probes approach. And when using cultural probes, it really demands this sort of rich explanation of your approach. So that includes talking about your stance as the designer, the decisions you made when developing and deploying the probes, also talking about your interpretation process of the cultural probe returns, and then talking about how these returns inspired design. So who am I? We see more of these positionality statements in HCI and HCI4D research, and I think that's a really positive development in the field. And this is really a central part of the cultural probe process. And to some degree, this still really contrasts other research approaches used in HCI that work to minimize or disguise the subjectivity inherent in their use. So who am I? I'm obviously white. When I'm in Kenya, I'm generally referred to as a Mzungu, which is Swahili for foreigner or white person. My skin color, my education level, comparative wealth are markers of difference between me and most people in Bungoma, the place where I work. I'm trained as an industrial designer. I'm now an HCI professor. I was born and socialized in the United States, and I, up until this year, enjoyed the privilege of being able to travel to Kenya, typically twice a year, to conduct research. I'm a native English speaker. At the time of this study, my Swahili was basic, but I'm very proud to say that during my sabbatical, I've really worked to improve my Swahili skills, and according to my teacher, I'm a solid intermediate level Swahili speaker, so I'm very proud about that. But despite that, I still require an interpreter when working in the field. Her name is Nightingale Simiyu. She's a resident of Bungoma. She's worked as my field assistant for nearly a decade. She's trained as a qualitative researcher and has generally advises me on culturally appropriate ways to conduct research in the area. So this is Bungoma. It's this town in Western Kenya where I've been working for nearly a decade. It's in the western part of the country, not too far from Lake Victoria. It's about a 7 or 8 hour drive outside of Nairobi, Kenya's capital. You can see from here, it has a bustling town center, streets lined with bars, restaurants, a bookshop, apartment complexes. And further away outside of downtown are these smaller market towns, these rural villages with clusters of mud and thatch houses surrounded by a shamba or farm. And here are the cultural probe activities I used in this study. Okay, so strictly speaking, cultural probes should be designed for the context where they're used. It's not a one-size-fits-all approach. And so my decisions about developing these activities were influenced by a number of things. The agency funding my research, the National Science Foundation, my university's institutional review board, as well as the institutional review boards in Kenya. There are lots of details about the decisions that guided the development of these probes. I'm not going to go into detail in them here, but they are in the paper. But I developed these 2 activities. The first one you see here, I guess on my left, I call responding to comment cards. And so I gave 22 households these cardboard boxes with these cards in on the side, 16 of them. The cards had open-ended questions printed on them. They were open-ended, playful, and really intended to elicit surprising responses. Some of the questions included, what is something Americans should know about Kenyans? Or Be quiet and listen and write down what you hear. Imagine that you can travel anywhere today. Where would you go and why? So the second activity is one that's pretty standard in cultural probes, a digital camera. I gave participants a digital camera. I put this little card on it with prompts of, again, sort of open-ended activities. Take a picture of work, of light, of faith, of anything that you like. And like the cards, these prompts were intended to elicit playful and surprising responses. So what have we done? In June 2016, Nightingale asked her friends to participate in this research project. We asked 22 households to engage with these activities over a 2-week period. After that time, Nightingale went back to their homes, swapped out the memory cards and the cameras, and collected the response cards. The following year, in May of 2017, I returned to these 22 households to update families on the status of my research project, and to also talk to them about the photographs they had taken and the responses they had written on the cards. I've since returned to their households in June of 2019, and I don't know, to be honest, I'm not sure when I'll be able to go back. Maybe this year, maybe next year. So I'll just briefly tell you a little bit about the cultural probe recipients. They came from a range of backgrounds in terms of where they lived and how they earned a living. A number of them engaged in informal jobs, such as working as a picky driver or a motorcycle taxi. There were women who sold produce for a living. We had a cobbler. A few of our participants had full-time employment at NGOs or one of the sugar factories located in the area. So interpreting the returns. And so to be clear, when I say returns, I'm talking about the hundreds of photographs that probe recipients took, as well as the responses to the comments on the cards. And again, I want to remind you that probes are meant to subvert the prevailing rational and scientific processes used in HCI. So they're not meant to produce a list of facts about the people who made them. And so what this means is that using traditional qualitative analysis techniques, in particular ones that seek to create an average picture, such as coding or thematic analysis, compromise the original intentions of probes. So I'm not going to be presenting any systematic findings about technology use in rural Kenyan households. But what I will talk about are my interpretations of some of the photos and responses to the comment cards. Because probe responses are meant to be interpreted rather than quantified. And I'll admit this is a difficult thing to do. When I first got back all these responses, I wanted to put them in an Excel spreadsheet. But again, that really violates the original intentions of the probes. They're not meant to be systematically analyzed. They're meant to be interpreted. So what did I do? I took all of these cards and I just put them on a big table in my office, and I left them there for about a year. I hung around with them. I read them every day. Oftentimes they would spark conversations between myself and students or different colleagues. I documented these conversations in a journal, and I started thinking about how these could translate into design. And even though I was in East Lansing and 8,000 miles away from Bungoma, sort of having this materials around me was a way to sort of remind me of being there. So and again, this interpretation process, and again, coming back to what I said a few slides ago, means really acknowledging and embracing the designer's subjective knowledge, especially the way it impacts their interpretation of the returns. So I fully acknowledge that these interpretations that I am about to present are influenced by my perspective as a middle-class white woman, my research interest, my personal experiences, and my idiosyncratic curiosities. But these interpretations provide a starting point for telling stories about the probe recipients and where they lived. And ultimately, that is what cultural probes are supposed to do. And as I show you these returns, I encourage you to tell your own stories about them, because again, cultural probes are supposed to be the starting point for telling these stories. I want to emphasize that All of the participants gave me permission to share these images and the responses. That was part of the consent process for being in the study. So in my paper, I grouped these interpretations into different categories. For example, there were images that draw attention to everyday life in Bungoma, including the auditory and olfactory ones. It reminds me of hearing roosters crowing in the morning, the sound of a garden hoe breaking the soil, the rumbling of these 18-wheeler trucks that travel on the Trans-African highway that runs just outside of Bungoma town. The returns reminded me of other sounds, the sputtering of a picky motorcycle, the radios broadcasting news about Kenya's then upcoming election, the African gold weaver. I was gonna try to mimic that sound, but my partner told me not to do that because it'd be embarrassing. But again, the point is that these returns sort of remind you of all these sort of auditory sounds and things in Bungoma. There are other sounds, frogs croaking and dogs barking, and you saw these listed on some of the responses. Pictures showed the visual sensations in Bungoma, including the clouds and the area's vast and expansive sky. When a participant was describing these clouds on one of these cards, they described them as nice. Images prompted memories of other things, smells. I mean, another fairly common sight are things like this, people drying fish to sell at the market, because again, you're close to Lake Victoria. There's a lot of fish around. In my paper, I have other vignettes. I talk about the things people use. There are pictures of mobile phones, like you see here, and other objects, including these plastic chairs, which I just personally am intrigued by these plastic chairs. You see them everywhere. They're inexpensive, lightweight, durable. They're significantly more comfortable than the wooden chairs that are also present in people's homes. And some people have 25 or 30 of these chairs that they rent to people organizing weddings and funerals. And this is a livelihood strategy, a way that people make a living using these plastic chairs. Some of the responses on the comment cards were written in Kiswahili. I'll read the translation here. This is saying, describe a good thing that happened today. The day was good because I had visitors from Michigan State University who traveled from Nairobi. We were also visited by our youngest daughter who brought us bananas and potatoes. All of this made a good day. Other cards captured these sort of anecdotes in people's lives. As I woke up early, I found my money, which was lost for a week. I was so happy for the money, and I rushed to the restaurant to have a cup of tea, which was hot and burnt my tongue. But from that day, I would never forget. Some of the responses made me laugh. This asking where you would go and why. Somebody said they would travel to Thailand to see elephants, which I thought was sort of funny because Kenya is widely known for having elephants. Other people talked about traveling to America to get a nice job, and because of our summer climate, which, you know, as someone who lives in Michigan, I found funny because it can get brutally cold. And here I'm just going to show you a few more of the images. And again, just let you look at them, reflect on them, make up your own stories about them. So, okay, So remember, ultimately, cultural probes are meant to provide designers with a rich and varied set of materials to inspire design concepts that are grounded in local cultures. And I think there's a compelling case to be made that these returns do that. And bear in mind what I've shown you are just a fraction of the returns. I literally have hundreds of these pictures, hundreds of these comment cards. But how do these support design? Again, coming back to the present project, the book I showed you earlier in the presentation, the returns were used to inspire a collection of speculative design proposals that eventually became a design workbook. And this is what I've done with the proposals that the returns I've collected. So here I'm going to talk about some of the design proposals that were inspired by these probe returns. So I've created a design workbook. These are collections of design proposals that are drawn together during projects to investigate different options for design. These concepts are typically speculative. So they're all technically plausible. You could make everything that I'm showing you, but they're not strictly speaking intended to be developed. Instead, they're meant to draw attention to new ways of thinking about design in Bungoma and developing regions more broadly. All of my proposals were inspired by my interpretations of the probe returns, as well as from different experiences over the course of my fieldwork in this part of Kenya. I'm going to talk about some of these proposals in detail. So the first is a wind-up music box that plays lullabies for dairy cows. This proposal was inspired by participant strategies to encourage their cows to produce more milk by playing soft music. So here the concept shows an antique music box that you wind up and it plays lullabies to cows at night. I mentioned earlier that I'm intrigued by these plastic chairs, especially how they're used to support some people earning a living. They own dozens of these chairs that, again, they'll rent out to weddings or funerals. So the concept you see here is one of these plastic chairs. It's been equipped with this pressure mounting system at the bottom. It also has this monitor on it. So the chair will monitor how long somebody's sitting on it and then translate that into how much money they should be charged for renting the chair. In Western Kenya, free-range chickens, or cuckoo in Swahili, are very common. You hear them, again, crowing in the morning. They're under your feet in households, and you eat them for dinner at night. In Bungoma, poultry production is a significant activity. Chickens are a source of protein for households. Women will typically sell their eggs as a way to generate income. And because they're so valuable, chickens are frequently stolen from people's compounds. So here I wondered how technology might help people better monitor their chickens. So what you see here is a surveillance camera. It monitors chickens throughout the day, and it'll send you updates about where they are to your mobile phone. These speculative design proposals can also be used to ask more provocative questions about design. So we know that companies like Google and Facebook are continuing to invest enormous resources into improving internet access in rural Kenya and other parts of Africa. But I wondered why they don't also invest in other ways for people to access information. So this is my concept for a library that's situated in downtown Bungoma. The library is sponsored by Google. You see their name on the entrance there. I mean, there are libraries in Kenya, much fewer than we're accustomed to having in the United States, and they're very uncommon in rural parts of the country. So the last concept I'm going to talk about is my attempt to think critically about the types of applications that get developed and don't get developed in HCI4D and ICTD. And to also ask questions about the power relations inherent in our research and what the implications are, what are the implications of researchers from resource-rich institutions mostly dominating knowledge production about people in the global South. So this is a speculative system called Mtafiti Opticon. Mtafiti roughly translates into researcher in Kiswahili. And it's a system that lets research participants monitor researchers' behaviors. So I'm not the only academic researcher that works in this part of Kenya. I mean, dozens of people from various institutions. So research participants can use this system to send feedback to a university's IRB or NACOSTI, that's the institution that monitors Western researchers in Kenya. It also allows them to rate researchers on how well they did the informed consent process. Was their compensation fair? Were they respectful? So I have lots more of these concepts. My workbook includes novel possibilities about technology that I think really broaden the HCI4D and ICTD communities' concern, that looks about how you can design for things other than what's commonly been done, developing mobile applications to address traditional socioeconomic concerns, things related to, health or education. I mean, my concepts draw attention to non-digital technologies, absurd technologies, and technological interventions that aren't really guided by the constraints typically considered when developing HCI4D and ICTD interventions. Further, these ideas aren't really focused on solving a problem. Again, they're focused on creating dialogues and understandings of the context where I work. So again, in addition, design workbooks clearly support the visualization of different design ideas. They're also meant to spark conversations between designers and the people they're designing for. So in summer of 2019, I returned to participants' households and I shared the design workbooks with them. And my findings from doing this suggest that integrating design workbooks into these interviews supported more of a participant-driven interview process. The images prompted rich responses about the context and where the ideas could conceivably exist. Participants' reactions drew attention to some of the practical problems that might accompany the introduction of these ideas into their communities. And significantly, the responses also included critical feedback. Participants weren't shy about saying which ideas they liked and which ones they didn't like. And eliciting critical feedback from participants about design interventions in HCI4D and ICTD has sort of been this persistent problem in the field. But my use of design workbooks suggests that it is sort of a promising approach for ways to elicit critical feedback from people. I've written up these results. I'd love to come back and talk about them when we're able to get together again. So I'm going to move on to the discussion. So again, I'm reminding you that this study is an exploration of how to use cultural probes in HCI4D and ICTD research, and really HCI more broadly. And what distinguishes my use of cultural probes from other studies is that I was really interested in staying true to Gaber's original intentions and really taking advantage of sort of the subversive ways that probes are meant to be used. Also, this is, to my knowledge, one of the only attempts to use cultural probes in a place like Bungoma, Kenya. So in using cultural probes demands providing this rich explanation of your approach. I've done some of that here, talking about my stance as the designer, my interpretation process, and how the probes inspired design. So here I'm going to elaborate on the broader implications of using cultural probes in design work. And again, sort of getting back to this initial idea of how we can do design differently in these fields. And using cultural probes can benefit design by one, raising questions about generalizability, objectivity in research, as well as about the pursuit of a single design solution. So questioning generalizations. So again, returning to the Presence Project. The book details how cultural probes emerge from a desire to develop a new design research method, to uncover non-stereotypical insights about older adults. And in the book, Gaber and his colleagues argue that these traditional design methods lead to designs that emphasize the negative aspects of people's lives, of older adults' lives. My use of cultural probes was motivated by a similar concern, to question generalizations about developing regions and the people who live in them. Words like poor, marginalized, and underserved are too frequently used in HCI4D and ICTD to characterize people, populations, and contexts. They're often used uncritically and often without any consideration how they sort of perpetuate the power imbalances between researchers and the people we research. But these probe responses clearly draw attention to other aspects of people's lives. They captured the ordinary, the humorous, and the routine aspects of people. They drew attention to sort of the unique factors that make Bungoma, Kenya, Bungoma, Kenya. And in my experience, reporting these non-generalizable and one-off observations can be difficult to uncover and report using traditional research methods. And reporting these types of findings, I think, is especially important in the fields of HCI4D and ICTD. In particular, using cultural probes to respond to scholars' critiques of a tendency within these communities to homogenize African users' diverse technological experiences. A probe's approach allows researchers to understand specific contexts on their own terms and work to avoid the dangers of oversimplifying Africans' experiences. I like this meme. I think this sort of captures this idea. You see Robin here saying, I want to go to Africa, and then Batman slapping him and saying, name the country, and this sort of reminder that, Africa is a continent made up of 54 countries. So questioning objectivity. Again, cultural probes emerge as a response to the limitations inherent in traditional user research methods, especially those that tend to render the researchers this detached authority. And this sentiment reflects broader critiques of objective social science methods that position researchers as unbiased and value-free. And as I've demonstrated, cultural probes force you to account for all of the messiness in research. And again, I think accounting for this messiness is especially important in the fields of HCI4D and ICTD, especially the stance of the designer. Like many people in these research communities, we're not members of the communities where we conduct our research. So revealing oneself throughout the design process can foster discussions about what it means to design for and to conduct research in communities that you're not a part of. And talking more about the designer stance can be useful for understanding what is gained and what's lost from observing as an outsider. And my hope is that it can also support reflection among African-born and African-based designers about how their experiences benefit their own design work. So finally, cultural probes are useful for questioning the pursuit of a single design solution. So I imagine this image is familiar to some of you. I use it in my own HCI class. It's the design funnel developed by Bill Gaver that sort of documents the design process of winnowing down to a single final solution in design. Arriving at a single solution, requires this narrowing of the design space. But a probe's approach offers an alternative to this. It supports developing a wide range of proposals and allows designers to explore different issues without committing to a single idea. The proposals that I developed and showed you a little while ago are intentionally unfinished. They're unfinished so that they can support conversations between me and the probe recipients and the broader HCI4D ICTD research community. I want my concepts to spark discussions about what researchers should and shouldn't design. And I'm more interested in these conversations as an outcome of the design process, more so than a testable prototype or a commercially viable system. And given that so many large-scale ICTD projects tend to fail, it might be worth adopting a research approach that results in design concepts that aren't necessarily meant to be implemented, but which are instead intended to support conversations between designers and the communities they're designing for. So like all methods, cultural probes have their limitations. I mean, ultimately it's me. I developed the design concepts, I primarily conducted the research and wrote up the results. This limitation demonstrates the difficulty of truly implementing design methods that decenter Western perspectives throughout the design and research processes. There are no simple solutions to this problem. One way I'm addressing it in my work is I teach a mini course on design to computer science students at the Jomo Kenyatta University of Agriculture and Technology in Juja, Kenya, and introducing them to cultural probes and encouraging them to use them in their own work. And I look forward to being able to do that again when we can travel. So to summarize, I began this talk by sort of raising questions about how we could think about design differently in the fields of HCI4D and ICTD. I presented my use of cultural probes. Again, this is part of a longer 5-year project investigating technology use in rural Kenyan households. And I hope I've convinced you that there are some benefits of considering this highly subjective and design-led approach in your work. And what I presented and what I'm continuing to explore in my own research is how we can have a design approach that acknowledges the ways that knowledge is subjective, situated, negotiated, and part of an ongoing process that also acknowledges the role that ambiguity plays in design outcomes. And I think this begins to look differently, that looks different than the more rational and scientific approaches that are more commonly used in HCI4D, ICTD, and HCI more broadly. And my conclusion is that as researchers and designers, I just encourage us all to continue to re-examine these traditional design processes, to continue to challenge the status quo so that we can avoid more of the same failed interventions, and work to better understand the communities we study, and also allow them to better understand us and the work we do. So that concludes my talk. I want to thank my collaborator Nightingale, Dr. Stephen Kamani at Jomo Kenyatta University, and Willis Akumu for their assistance. This research was supported by the National Science Foundation. So I'd be happy to answer questions. Thank you. I'm just gonna put these headphones on so I can hear better.
Thank you so much. If anyone has any questions, you can either just unmute yourself and ask, or you can put it in the chat. But just to start off, I can ask a question. Could you talk about the initial reactions when you introduce cultural probes? Are people intrigued and excited and they just jump right in and start using them? Or does it take some sort of explanation? How do you kind of describe what they are?
So that's a really good question, Julie. Thank you for asking that. In hindsight, I probably should have mentioned that a little bit more. So Julie's asking about what is it like to introduce these to people. I mean, some of this I contribute to, I've had a longer term relationship with these households. They've participated in interviews. So it wasn't too drawing to sort of ask them if they would be interested in pursuing other activities. Most people were, everybody was amenable to taking the pictures and doing the exercises. And again, that does admittedly, it speaks to these, I'm this white Western researcher, people, based on my experiences, participants are often very willing to engage in these activities. But another thing I'm beginning to examine more in the work I do is, what are the impacts of asking people to participate in these research projects? We have these participatory approaches that are more commonly used in HCI, but there's not a lot of work on the people who participate in the processes and how it impacts them. Like I said, most people are fine doing it, but I think digging a little deeper and asking them their reactions to it is something I plan to do more in my research. And of course, people were compensated. They received copies of the pictures, kept the cameras. And yes, does that answer your question?
We have some positive comments, and then our next question is from Kristen. The question is, I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how the device or object used to collect returns affects the returns themselves. For example, differences between the card responses and photos, or photos taken on a digital camera versus a mobile phone camera.
So I want to make sure I clarify this. So participants receive both. And again, I want to make sure I'm understanding this. So things like counting responses, again, the responses weren't meant to be quantified. So I can't really speak to any differences in terms of taking pictures and answering cards. I didn't really count things. I didn't count how many returns households had. There's no quantitative analysis in any of this work. Coming back to the questions about mobile phones and picture taking, I do want to talk about that because that's something I get asked repeatedly about. And I want to make it abundantly clear that for the most part in rural Kenya, people do not use their mobile phones to take pictures. There are a number of reasons for this. One, most people have very poor quality cameras on their mobile phones. Two, people use their phones for very limited amounts of time because many people don't have access to electricity, so you're not keeping it on to take pictures. Most people are reluctant to send pictures because it eats up their airtime. You're paying for use. And there's sort of cultural norms about picture taking that are different in Kenya than we're more accustomed to in the United States. I've written about this in another paper, but there is sort of this belief that just because people have mobile phones, and they do have mobile phones, but for the most part, and I'm really fairly confident in saying this, in rural parts of Kenya, mobile phones are not widely used to take pictures. So does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so. Thank you.
Okay.
Next in line to ask is Cliff.
Hey, Cliff.
Hi, thanks so much for the talk. I really appreciate it. The question I have is, I'm working on reviewer guidelines for CHI 2022 right now, such is my life. And what would you like me to put in there about cultural prose? Is there anything we could do from kind of a programmatic standpoint to help improve how we assess these things? Anything we could do to, I don't know, like your talk feels like a methodology talk to me, right? In a lot of ways. And it's really clarifying an important method. And I just want to know how we carry that forward.
Thanks, Cliff. That's another really good question. I don't know. I'll admit, I really struggled to publish this work at CHI. This paper was rejected 7 times. I mean, I can laugh about it now, but I mean, reflecting on that process, there are a number of things wrong. I think people were uncomfortable with me writing in the first person. I made it very clear in the paper that all of the results are biased. I wasn't going to shy away from that. Again, that may seem to make reviewers uncomfortable. I don't know. I mean, I think carefully reading the paper that Kirsten Boehner, Phoebe Sangers, and Janet Vertesi have written about probes, they do a really lovely job of summing up some of these things. I don't know, it's difficult. None of my work it's very difficult for anything I do to be anonymous. I'm sort of comfortable with that. I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question. I don't know. I mean, I think making the community more comfortable with people writing in the first person, I think there's something to be said about that. I'm not going to black out a bunch of stuff in my papers so it can be more anonymous, because I end up blacking out all of the paper. I mean, I think I can't separate who I am from the work that I do. And I think it's actually a lot stronger if I write about it and present it in a way, but it does pose challenges for the CHI review process. And it might be interesting to see how other fields handle this. I mean, in anthropology or even African studies, Africanists have written a great deal about this, but I don't know, Cliff, that's a really good question. gnaw on it and reflect on some of the review comments I received from this work and get back to you.
Yeah, please do. That'd be great. Thanks.
I do think, you know, in terms of, I think they're, you know, making part of the IRB process to make sure that participants consent to have their images shared in research papers. I'll admit early on in my career, I didn't do that. And I think that's really important to do, to, you know, make sure that people know that, and for them, everybody's consented, but, you know, that part of this means that these pictures you've taken are going to be on YouTube, I think, and noting that in the paper, I think that's also important.
Great, thank you. John, would you like to ask your question?
Sure. Thanks for the talk. It was really interesting. I tend to kind of look back at these things, and Kathy Gregory published a paper in Administrative Science Quarterly in 1983 titled Native View Paradigms, in which she Native View Paradigms, in which she argued that these paradigms, which were improved understandings of context, generally were more useful to design than structural functionalist perspectives. So she was sort of bringing an anthropological, sociological perspective to this topic. And this is a topic that's been around a number of times in the design of software and so forth. So it is, you know, I think it's an important line of work. It's also a kind of old and I would say insufficiently considered line of work.
So what are you talking about specifically? So this, I mean, speculative design, I mean, I think some of the broader ideas, questioning about objectivity and generalizability, those are established in other fields. But I think the speculative design, yeah, again, that seems new and less explored. And again, how to pull all these things together.
Well, I think the connection, at least the connection that I draw with your work, is that you're talking about a way of soliciting native views. Native views. And I think that's needed in the design world, because very often, well, to be perfectly blunt about it, design perspectives are very colonialistic. You know, we know better than you do what you need. So the result is this, that you will have. And trying to see the world the way they see it, which is of course a native view, is hard to do. And I think what you're talking about are some methods that kind of get at that.
Yeah, thank you. I agree with that. And it is challenging. But I think, you know, having Swahili, I think these are baby steps into, you know, one of the challenges with this sort of decolonial turn within HCI is that it's difficult to know what that actually looks like. And if we really think about what it's going to look like, it's going to look very different from how we think about design with prototypes and stuff. And but I do think these are sort of baby steps into sort of thinking about this sort of different way that design can be, and letting in other perspectives, other languages, other points of view. So thank you. I appreciate that.
Thank you. Ali, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, thank you for the talk, Susan. That's really interesting. I'm from Egyptian background, and I lived in Egypt for the past 20 years. And I have friends and relatives from all over the country and different socioeconomic backgrounds. I agree with you that that we should go beyond the issue of generalizing and the typical ideas of poverty and disenfranchisement. And I think it is important really to go into a new approach to design that's more subjective and more creative. But the problem is I find is that the issues of economics and politics specifically weigh so heavily on people's minds in that country that they have a hard time, and sometimes they even don't want to go beyond them. I can't tell you how many times I heard the comment from relatives or people who knew me well who would say, how would you know you're leaving eventually and you're not staying here? Or so my question is, how would you either incorporate these issues into the design without being limited to them, or go beyond them so that you can get something creative done or something different done?
So thank you, Ali. I don't think we've ever met in person, so it's nice to meet you. And I appreciate that comment. And I think you're absolutely right. And in hindsight, maybe I should have tempered my comments about terms like poor and marginalized, because I in no ways want to diminish that as a reality. I think my thinking about this has come from sort of pushing back on how I think the ICT community has sort of become one-sided and sort of overly focused on those aspects of life. So sort of to realize that that picture is incomplete. But I do feel like that needs to accompany sort of an asterisk saying I don't want to diminish the sort of realities that are based on economics and deep-seated global inequalities. But I do think there needs to be a more balanced perspective that I don't think has been given the attention that it deserves in ICTD and HCI4D.
Okay, thank you. Any ideas of how you would be able to incorporate them though, or is that?
Well, you know, I was selective about the probe returns in the photographs I did share. I could have shown a different set of returns and painted a different picture. So again, the subjectivity comes in that. I could have shared returns and responses to comment cards that laid bare those realities, and I chose not to for this presentation. So again, there are 800 pictures, 500 comment cards, and you can find instances where these economic realities, these disparities are evident in those. But and again, being transparent, I opted not to write or talk about those.
I see. Thank you.
But this method, using these, allows you will collect that information as well as the more mundane aspects of people's lives. And then as researchers, we decide how we interpret those and what we do with them.
Thanks.
Thanks. Next, we have a question from Robin. So following up on Cliff's question, what advice do you have for people in framing research that isn't intended to have a single design solution in writing? For example, for venues in HCI where there is a focus on design implications or design solutions. And then Naz has a follow-up on it, same question, but with, it just says with funding sources, which I see this was supported by the NSF. So I guess those are two questions.
So, hey, Robin. So asking how, asking how you write about a work that's not driven by solving problems?
Right, so any advice that you have for people, students who want to write similar types of work where it's not necessarily, the discussion is design implications, or this leads to something that we plan to design at the end of that. And I think you were starting to touch on that in your talk, but any advice for people in framing that, especially for venues where design is an outcome or can be an expected outcome?
I don't think I have good advice. Like I said, I mean, I would I would tell your students to read the paper and to be persistent, but I don't know, it was sort of demoralizing. I guess it's okay to talk about it. I mean, this work was really rejected 7 times, and it's not what it didn't change that much, but my sense is that it does make reviewers uncomfortable. I mean, putting all your cards on the table about your biases, talking about ideas that aren't meant to be developed. So I guess my only advice, you can read my paper and use it as a model that may or may not help, and just be persistent, because I think we can sort of change the norms in the community if more people start thinking about how we can do design differently that's not necessarily based on solving someone's perceived problems with a mobile phone app.
Thank you for that. And that's just the persistence advice is very timely, given that I think Chi reviews come out today. So thank you for that.
Good luck. And there's another question.
Yeah, there was a follow-up question. So along those lines, but what do you do when, depending on the funding sources? And Naz, if you want to like explain it more.
Yeah, I mean, I was really glad to see that, you know, your work was funded by the NSF. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to kind of how you've handled kind of potential expectations, kind of similar to what Drop-In was saying, but like at the funding level. Or
So
if that's a struggle at all or no.
So I want to thank Phoebe Sangers. Phoebe Sangers is an expert at figuring out how to take things like cultural probes and spinning them in a way that makes them fundable by the NSF. So I would look at send Phoebe an email, let her look at your grant proposal. So I go into more details about this in the paper, and I think it is something that really needs to be devoted attention to. And Bill Gaber, in all of his writings about cultural probes, never talks about sort of the ethical hurdles of getting them approved. So I felt like because I had to get approval from MSU's IRB, I had to get approval from that IRB in Kenya, I had to sort of hold back the probes. I mean, some of the activities are supposed to be more provocative, and I was uncomfortable in exploring what that meant in this context. So I think some of the ways that I negotiated this in the IRB process was, you know, referencing familiar methods that have been used in research conducted in Africa. So there are lots of commonalities between cultural probes and diary studies and photo elicitation studies. So I cased it that way as a way to make it sort of not seem so, I don't know, wild and crazy, but making it more more understandable to people who may be less familiar with this approach to research. But I do feel like I would have wanted to push the envelope a little more with sort of the questions and the activities that I asked people to do, but I was restrained in doing that because I needed to get these approvals to do the research. So I think there is a fine line in balancing those things. But my hope is that by publishing this work, this method, and again, will be more accepted. And this is again, a sort of smaller step into making it more acceptable. I think that's the word I'm looking for.
Thank you.
Does that answer? That's a good question too. Yeah, I didn't cover that in the talk, but I talk about it much more in the paper, sort of navigating those things, because it is tricky.
Thank you.
Thank you. I think that's all the time we have for questions now. There's one last comment by Brandon, which would be useful to read, but it's 2 p.m. So thank you for coming and everyone for attending the talk. And I hope you have a good Thursday.
Thank you. I hope you have a happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe.
Take care. Nice seeing you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.